Hello, everyone, and welcome to an annual training on the NHA data collection reporting forms, part 1 and part 2. My name is Liz Biemeyer. I'm an assistant coordinator with the National Heritage Area Program in our Washington, D.C. office. And today I will share a PowerPoint with you and take questions you have about filling out the forms. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So the purpose of this training is to explain why we collect this data annually, review what are known as the OMB approved forms. OMB is the Office of Management and Budget at the federal government level. There's 2 forms. We refer to them as the part 1 and part 2 form, and I'll explain what those are. And then take questions from you all on how to fill out the forms or any other questions about the data collection process that we have. And the expectation is that this will have an outcome of you all as the NHAs deepening your understanding of the use of this data, and then, you know, the physical part of actually filling out the form. So this is being recorded. I please ask you to stay muted until we have the Q&A. You are free to use the chat function to ask questions during the presentation, although I do have a time at the end that is just for Q&A. So as I'm presenting, it's sometimes hard to see the chat going on because I'm only using one screen. So you can put your question in there in case so you don't lose it, but I will be doing the presentation and then doing more of a Q&A at the end. And like I mentioned, this slide deck will be provided after the meeting along with the recording. So the general agenda is to go over what the annual data collection is, including some whys, whens, wheres, hows about that process. A brief overview of the part 1 and 2 forms, and then we can dive into more detail during a Q&A or what I'm calling like a generic office hour, so kind of led by whatever questions you all have. Since we did do more of a deep dive in the part 1 and part 2 last year, I'm taking this here as more of an overview. And I did share the recording from last year's presentation and training that does dive in a little bit more. So if you're looking for that, I would recommend that you look at that recording as you're kind of going over the forms yourself with your organization. So what is the annual data collection? It consists of 2 forms, as I noted, a part 1, which we refer to as the funding report, and a part 2, which is a progress report. These numbers and symbols afterwards are kind of the system where we had to go through the approval process, which I'll explain a little bit later. But the form did go through an Office of Management and Budget approval process, and in that approval process, it's given a control number. So you'll note that that control number is in the margin of the form, but it's a more kind of federal government numbers, so we usually just refer to them as the part 1 and part 2. But just so you know that what those numbers are referencing this particular form in kind of the OMB's approval process. These are different than your reporting requirements under your cooperative agreements, which are the agreements where you get your federal financial assistance. But they may have some similar data points or data collection associated with them, and we see sometimes as your cooperative agreement reporting can help inform these annual data reporting forms as well. So they kind of sometimes ask similar things, but sometimes their purpose is different. So why do we do this? In your designating legislation, there are sections that refer to reporting on an annual basis, any years that receive federal funds. So this is just an excerpt I pulled from the latest designation legislation, the Dingle Act from 2019, but it does note submitting a report to the Secretary that describes activities, expenses, income of a reporting entity, including any grants under that year that the report is made. And as you know, 6 of them were designated under this, so all 6 were kind of held to this, have the same language referring to them. But you may look at your own designating legislation to see how it's noted in that. So more background as to why we're doing this. Some of this started back in 2003, looking at kind of baseline indicators of what heritage areas were doing. There was some information collected annually. The forms were a lot shorter, which maybe some of you wish they were, but they were a lot shorter back then. But you can see that time frame, almost 10 years of looking at surveying baseline indicators and how we can collect this annually. Then a working group was created in 2012 to look at more performance-based reporting, so a little bit more in depth or detail of what was actually happening at your organization throughout the year. A pilot program was started in 2013, meaning we're kind of testing out the forms, what kind of questions did the forms need to have on them? How did the NHAs feel about answering them? And then from that feedback, they refined the forms, updated them over the 3 years of using that pilot program. And then in 2016, started this Office of Management and Budget info collection approval process. And that approval process took quite some time. We received approval in April of 2021. So if you recall, last year was the first year we were using these forms. But the idea there was to go through the approval process to understand what information was being collected from the public. Is there a Paperwork Reduction Act, meaning is it necessary? Is there authority to do this? What method are you using? How often are you asking? How many entities or people? And kind of understanding that. Is it a general public inquiry? Is it specifically to only a certain set of organizations? So those are the types of things we had to go through in terms of the approval process. So once you get approval, it's good for about 3 years, which means every 3 years you have to go through what they call it's not a full approval process. It's more of a refreshment approval process. So starting this spring, I'll start looking into that because we'll be up in 2024. And just a reminder, the previous forms we're using that do not have that OMB control number are no longer valid and shouldn't be used this year. And along with that approval process came, say a requirement, but a very heavy recommendation of providing training every year on the form. So this also grew from that as well. So who is involved in the annual data collection? There's the NHA program office in Washington who issues the call out for the forms to be filled out. We have our regional coordinators that you work with more frequently with your agreements. That could be the same person as your agreements technical representative. You could have 2 people that you work with. Then there's the National Heritage Area, usually executive directors, who is typically the authorized rep to sign off on the forms. You may have other NHA staff to help fill out the forms, whether that's an admin or kind of operations person or a grants or budget person. Some NHAs may look to partners to provide some of the data that they're asking for, or that the forms ask for. That's up to you about how you need to gather that from partners or in your own record management. But here's a general flow chart. On the left are kind of folks at the NHA local level that may be involved, and those arrows kind of have to be determined in terms of your organization and how you do that. But that first node there is the executive director or the authorizing rep who would sign off on the forms. They are the ones that then submit to our Washington, D.C. office. We ask that you copy your regional NHA coordinator or your agreements technical representative if that person is different. And then at the Washington level, I review and compile all the data, and I'll share in a couple slides as to what happens to that data. And when do we collect this? The Washington office puts out the call for submissions typically at the end of November, beginning of December. This year it went out on Tuesday, November 29th. I provided blank forms as the Word documents for you that's fillable for you to be able to fill out. And then they're due every January, towards the end of January, and this year they're due on Thursday, January 26th. And that is a hope that we'll have some preliminary data compiled for when the Alliance of National Heritage Areas comes to DC in February. So we'll have a little bit to share there in terms of a summary of what year 2022 looked like. We ask that you submit the signed forms to our email address, nha@nps.gov. So I'll monitor that. I check it now that this is, we're kind of in the data collection season. I'll be checking it probably a couple times a week. And then in January, I'll probably check almost every day. And I noted, please CC your regional coordinator or agreements technical representative if different. I ask that you rename your files so at least your heritage area name is in the title along with the year. I will acknowledge receipt of it so you know that it was successfully submitted. If there are any follow-up questions during the review, you may get an email from me asking for clarification on something. I find it easiest if you save the filled out Word document as a PDF and then sign the PDF. But I've had people also just sign the Word document. That's okay as well. The biggest thing is that it's signed. And we've had the question in the past when Grant Solutions was a system that we started using, there was a question as to whether or not we can submit these via Grant Solutions. And at this time, no, because these aren't the same forms that our financial assistance kind of system recognizes. And to be honest, I'm not in Grant Solutions at the same level as our regional coordinators and our agreements technical representatives are. So I don't necessarily have automatic access to your agreements in that system. So getting to how do we actually use this information that's collected? Multiple ways. Usually refer back to it multiple times during the year. So some of it is I'll compile it and create a summary chart that shows everyone's data on one document. We sometimes use it if we're asked for annual budget justifications in developing the Green Book, which is the executive branch's request to the Hill in terms of what they would like a budget to look like. The main thing I would say, or at least the most outward facing way, is our annual NPS NHA program by the numbers report or a year in review. And here I've done some screenshots here to show what last year's looked like. And that is typically done in April around right now in the past couple of years. And it's looking as like, I'd like to really solidify that as a known time is during Park Week, National Park Week, which is usually around April 16th, 17th, 18th timeframe, and sometimes coincides with the Spring Alliance meeting. So I'm looking to kind of keep that as like a known time when this is expected. And last year I worked a little bit with our Office of Communications here in Washington, D.C. to see how we could kind of promote it through their avenues as well. And during Park Week to see how we can highlight it usually Park Week has certain themes on each day. And so how does this best fit with one of the themes that they're promoting? Sometimes we look to the data collection when we're doing briefings for NPS leadership or management, if they're looking for particular types of projects being done. We also share these when NHAs are going through their evaluation process. Really good kind of annual summary of what an heritage area did over its time being evaluated. Also better to understand the needs of you all across the country based off of information you provide on the part one. And then also sometimes to connect you as NHAs to other NPS programs or NPS partners. If in reviewing, I note that multiple people, multiple organizations are working on a certain topic or a certain type of project. And I know that there's, some other initiative or some other effort in the Park Service going on around that, I can help make those connections. And then also sometimes in informational material presentations. This is a presentation that I thought was really cool. There was, I definitely looked to the data collection for some ideas of what to put in it. But I was asked to do a presentation to a delegation from Indonesia who was here visiting. And so I worked with our Office of International Affairs to do the presentation. It was just a general overview of the NHAs as a place, but also as a model for preservation and conservation and recreation and education. And so, trying to say how how, so I use this one example from Upper Housatonic Valley about the work they're doing with the tribal government there on archaeological investigations, but also then how that information is going to help inform a trail that they're putting together. So I wonder, how does your NHA use this type of information? How do you maybe use it to share with your partners, or do you use it in your own evaluation of what your organization had been doing, kind of like a mini evaluation every year? But I invite you to put that in the chat so you all can kind of see what each other are doing and how they use it. So Justin from Atchafalaya says, we use this info on our annual report infographic. Yes, great. I know sometimes with the timing of this being due to us in January, sometimes I also have NHAs that will have their annual report kind of and be done by December around this time. And so they'll also kind of submit it as an attachment when they submit the forms. Sure. So Heather from Abraham Lincoln says, we share it with our steering council and partners at our January meeting. Great. I know I've also seen some, maybe more informally, but some social media posts about maybe some of your numbers or your kind of cumulative numbers across the year. Okay. Thanks for sharing. All right. So here's where I'm going to briefly go over the two forms. So this is just a screenshot of the front of the part one, but we refer to the part one as the funding report. It's about 4 pages long. Here we ask questions about staffing levels with your local coordinating entity. We ask about how much heritage partnership program funding you received and the match that you had for that, some of the match sources as well, non-federal match sources. And then some sustainability planning that you've been being done at your organizational level. And then I would say the chunk of it is accomplishments, challenges, and needs you may have had over the past year. Sorry, just going back to the chat to make sure you see. Okay, Annie from Essex said, we use in our annual summary report and also with our trustees and commissioners. It's very helpful. Great. And sometimes here, the part one is where I may go to see, okay, when it notes to ask 3 to 5 accomplishments, I'll look to see when someone's asking, hey, what's something, either sometimes the question is a specific heritage area, sometimes it's a specific kind of type of project. So I'll be looking through to see which ones did projects relating to more accessible recreational opportunities. So sometimes your accomplishments will note that. The challenges as needs sometimes comes up when we're doing briefings up to management or with some of the budget conversations. So those are also, really good to be truthful and very straightforward about what some of those are, so we can best hopefully help you with those. The part two is what is the longer of the two forms. It's about 12 pages, but hopefully it doesn't cause too much heartburn there. It is seen as like a progress report, but really how your implementation of your management plan has been going. And not all 12 pages and all questions may actually pertain to what your organization does. So that's why I say it might not be a full 12 pages you're filling out. But it is trying to get to measurable outputs and measurable outcomes of your projects and programs. You'll see that it's broken up into kind of topic of the types of the buckets of work that NHAs typically do. So you have questions about recreation, education, conservation, preservation, and then I'll talk a little bit about the end part, but those are the general ones. We're asking too, did you provide any sub-grants with your heritage area money? If so, what type of projects were they? Were any complete this past year that you can say kind of what that outcome or output was? So that's why if you don't have a sub-grant program, some of this will just be then not filled out. But I do want to ask that if you don't have a sub-grant program, that you put like NA or not applicable versus just putting 0. 0 could mean you have a grant program, but you didn't provide any grants in that category, for example. But if you just don't have one, then NA would write, or you have a grant program, but you never give grants related to that topic, then you could put NA. So here, I know this has come up before. I mentioned this last year in last year's training as well, but part 8 of the part 2 does ask more about community engagement. So not just these general buckets of work, but more about kind of the NHA as a model for networking and partnerships. So here it's looking at community engagement. And here I found this, I was taking a training that the Park Service offers. And I thought this was really good. I know we've had a lot of questions about what is a formal partner, what is an informal partner. The form asks you to note the number of formal and informal partners. So trying to give you a little bit more guidance on kind of how you can frame that when you answer it. So take a look at this. Here, it's basically statutory. So there's 3 kinds of partnerships that is seen here. One is statutory partnerships that are described by law. So some of you may have a noted partner in your designating legislation or partners. You may have formal partnerships, and that's by what is defined here by written documentation. So that could be your subgrant program, that could be some other memorandum of understanding that you have with another organization that you work with. Or you can have informal partnerships, and sometimes that's just by spoken word. Maybe that's sometimes how you work with some volunteer groups. There isn't necessarily an agreement that you're signing, but they've said, hey, we'll come on Saturday morning and help set up this event. Great, they show up. You know how many people were there, how many hours they worked, but you're not necessarily having a written agreement between like the executive director and whoever's the head of whatever that organization is. So I thought this could be helpful as you look to see how you count your partners. Also, I want to remind you that we did have a best practices series on partnerships last year. Those have been recorded and are available on our YouTube page. So check those out if you want to take a look. And then lastly, we have photos are always welcome. And I know the part 2 kind of notes that if you want to submit photos, I'll just share some different ways that they're shared. Sometimes, like for example, for Blue Ridge has shared them separately with a photo log. You can submit them within the form itself. But I ask that if you do that, it's an inserted photo and not just a scanned PDF, because then the photos don't become available to actually use in, for example, the buy-in of the numbers report here. So if you do it in the form, some do it throughout. So like Sangre de Cristo has put it if they're talking about a specific subgrant program or specific project they worked on, they'll put the photo right there. Some have done it all the way at the end of the report and provided captions. For example, Northern Plains and South Park have done that. No matter what way you do it, please provide a caption and a photo credit, if not to the NHA itself. If it was some other individual photographer or other organization, please provide the credit so we can give credit where credit's due. So this is an example of how I've used some of the photos. This again is our by the numbers report, but also in the presentation I did with the Indonesian delegation, or sometimes with our social media, though you may have noticed that's slowed down a lot. So there's different ways that we can use it. And again, these aren't required, but always welcomed if you want to submit photos. So that was the general overview I wanted to provide. Just as a recap, hopefully this helped a little bit more of your understanding of why we collect and how you fill out the forms. Reminder that we have these OMB approved forms. The old forms will not be accepted. send the signed forms to our NHA at nps.gov website due Thursday, January 26th. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to help. And if you want more of an in-depth thing, happy to just set up a separate meeting with you all. But with that, let me make sure I don't. Okay. So I set it up where it could just be a Q&A because we have done these a couple times now, but I recognize not everyone on the call has necessarily filled it out before. If you're a new staff member to an NHA, maybe this is the first time doing it. So I'm kind of happy to stick around in a way to answer any questions you may have. If you even want me to pull up the forms themselves and go over a specific thing, I can do that. But I just thought I'd let this next kind of half hour be whatever you needed it to be in terms of answering your questions. So I'll stop sharing so I can see everyone. And we can just open it up to any questions folks have. Feel free to either put them in the chat or come on camera, unmute yourself. Pretty informal on how we're going to do that here for the next half hour. If you feel good and you're like, great, this is a great overview, I'll let you know if I have any questions. Happy to, you're welcome to drop off, and I'll wish you all a happy holiday season if that's the case. I will note too, I see Greenway Trust is here and put in the chat a thank you. Thanks. Just reminded me, I know last year when I went over the forms, it was kind of also looking at, okay, if you're one of the 6 2019 NHAs, here's some kind of tips on how you can fill out the form based off you still going through your management planning process. I'm happy to say that 3 of those management plans have been approved. So while the form, noting for 2022, you're still working on it very much most of the year. That will still kind of be your focus for your reporting, but next year you'll be able to kind of take a little bit different approach to how you write it in terms of how you started to implement. So just another congratulations to those folks who went through the process and got approved. We're still waiting on Appalachian Forest and Susquehanna. They have been submitted up to the department, so we're just waiting now. And Sacramento San Joaquin is still plugging away, so we're going to work with them more the next year to get that done. So any other questions? Kind of things you feel like you always are spending a lot of time on and don't know why, or how can we kind of, how much detail is needed in a specific area, stuff like that. Would be happy to pull up a form and dive a little deeper if you'd like. And also, I just wanted to note too that if anyone is a new staff member at an NHA, and this might be your first year filling it out, I do have all of the ones from the past years. So if you want to look to see how your organization filled out in the past, if it isn't readily available to your own from your own records, let me know. I'm happy to email those to you. Heather, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was trying to get my camera to come on. Okay, and I know the answer, but I'm going to ask because I've been where you are and no one's asking questions. So I'm going to ask a question that I know the answer to, but I think is very important. Let's say you're filling out the form and you have great things that you've done, but they don't fit in like the designated categories. Where do we put them on the form, Liz?
Great question, Heather, and not planned it at all. It really wasn't. There is a There is a question at the end of part 2 that is kind of note anything else that you feel like wasn't covered in the previous section. So that's where you can do it. At the end, so it's before you note your kind of highlight or best practice from the year, and after the volunteer or after the community engagement section, I believe. So there is one there. Feel free to put it in there. And yeah, I capture that as well. Take that in consideration when I compile everything. So
Thank you.
yeah, thanks. I'll note last year when compiling all the data, I noted that there was an uptick in projects or sub grants around kind of conservation work, looking more, water quality or air quality monitoring, some more of that maybe natural resource or wetlands conservation, landscape conservation scale stuff. So I don't, so it's kind of interesting to see kind of where the trends are in terms of where your projects have taken you, whether it's based off of the life of your NHA or types of new partners you may be engaging, or also what your local community is really interested in at this time. I think some of it maybe also related to people getting outdoors more with the pandemic and looking to see how can we provide a little bit more for them in that, knowing that there's this desire to have these places. So I'll be curious to see if there's some other kind of trend noted this year, as kind of more things opened up and I hate to say it got back to normal because it's not normal. It's a new thing, but just kind of curious to see, because I know the past 2 years was really about how did we pivot? How did we do some more virtual engagement? Which I know some of you have continued because there was still value in that, even though you could have met in person, you were seeing kind of getting more of a wider audience with some of those options. So I'm just curious to see kind of what this year's data collection will show. Anything else? So Justin asked, do we think we'll keep these forms for a while? Well, as I noted, the approval of them lasts for 3 years, so I assume these will also be used next year. But like I noted, this calendar year, I'll start looking into how we go through the reapproval process and whether that might be a point to kind of reevaluate the forms. I kind of leave it that way because I don't know exactly what the reapproval process is going to be, but the approval process, I mean, the approval process, and maybe Justin, this was before I was kind of in it, I guess, when you started with the Chapelaya, but I did go out and ask a handful of NHAs kind of these questions that the approval process has to kind of get feedback from them as to what the forms, kind of the burden, the hourly burden, kind of the questions, are they necessary, are they applicable, stuff like that. So I'm not sure if the reapproval process will have a similar kind of outreach to the intended user of the form, to get feedback on that, but it could be a chance to see, kind of reevaluate the forms, I'll put it that way. But at least for this year and next year, I see them being used. One other tip I can note when filling out maybe the part 2 in particular is if you are talking about a project or a program that you carried out, noting clearly who, if you had any partners, who those partners were, maybe what that partner brought to it, or if it was a kind of another partner as the main lead, what you brought to that or that project from the NHA's perspective. Also, sometimes the kind of breakdown of the funding, if the partner provided funding, how much that was. So it's just a little tip to kind of think about when you fill it out. All right, if there are no other questions,
Hey Liz, I'll ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Hi, guys. I often wondered, we've done this format for a long time, and also because of the processes it took to get the forms approved. But I wonder too, just kind of, and this can be something people email us or share now in the chat. If we had some kind of online system for entering this content, would folks like that, or do they like sticking with what we have and what we know now? If we did something online, that could help us use the data more quickly, because it would all be electronic versus sharing and then us having to manually type the information in. So would it be a big deal if we switched from the forms to some kind of database or other format, online Google form or something?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. For everyone, Katie and I have talked about this a little bit, and going through the approval process for the forms was quite the lift. That at that moment last year, it was like, let's just get these approved. But I think this is something else to consider, at least I want to consider going through the reapproval process, is just getting clarification from our MPS information collection officer, but also the Office of Management and Budget, is that basically my understanding is we have the approval of ants asking these questions and collecting information based off of these questions. The medium in which we do it, I think can change. And so that's what I need to look into a little bit more, is if we use the same exact questions, or if we did change a little bit in the reapproval process, or how that works. we're getting that aspect approved. So if we put it on an online form to be filled out, that's still technically approval. We would just have to note the OMB control number and the date that everything is good for. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple yeses for online. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that'll be definitely something look for in the future, and maybe something we can implement for next year's submission. Okay. Okay, yeah, Kathy notes from Yuma notes having the ability to still be able to export the report. Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, this is just in my mind of what some brainstorming Katie and I have done, but you know, you would fill out the form, and I believe there could be an option for you to get emailed what you filled in, so you would have a copy, and then when I would see it, I would also have the copy. And then it would just be easier. I think I could also just export everyone's answers as one file, or do the individual, you know, 53 that report right now. So Kathy, I do think you would be able to have access to it, what you submit, but I'll keep that in mind when I look into options. Yeah, option, would it be an actual like database where you would have to have a username and login and then put it in, or could it just be like a Google form? But there, I'd almost want it to be able to save as you go, or still provide the Word documents, so you would have something to fall back on or kind of refer to as you fill out the actual form in case you can't do it in one sitting. But yeah, thanks for your feedback on that. Katie, thanks for asking. Okay, any last questions? All right, well, with that, I'll thank everyone for joining. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific questions as you fill it out, or refer to our YouTube channel for last year's presentation that goes into a little bit more detail on each part 1 and part 2. And hope everyone has a happy and healthy holiday, and I probably will not see you until, well, best practices on Thursday. So join best practices on Thursday this week. And if I don't see you there, then have a great holiday. Thanks, everyone.